and welcome to Dungeons and Drama Nerds. My name is Nick, and today I'm here with Percy.
Hello.
And Todd.
Hey there.
This week, we are here to talk about plays set in space. Specifically, we're going to be talking about The Absentee by our very own Julia Doolittle and Last Ship to Proxima Centauri by Greg Lamb.
So we wanted to start by just giving you brief sort of summaries of the gist of these plays if you have not read them, although we would certainly encourage you to seek them out and read them. The Absentee by Julia Doolittle is about the operator of a beacon that is very far out in space, and it is about her sort of dealing with an explosion in the area of space in which she operates, and sort of dealing with all of the things that sent her to space, as well as a very persistent campaign volunteer from somebody back on Earth who is running for president of the United States.
Something that I just really love about that play that I also think is important for people to know is that the operator is alone with her AI that she sometimes imagines is her dead girlfriend.
Yes, that is important.
And it is unclear to the audience how much the AI does or does not represent or reflect that girlfriend, which I think is very fun. And then in Last Ship to Proxima Centauri by Greg Lamb, this is about 2,000 years after the destruction of Earth, because we never got our shit together to deal with climate change. A bunch of vessels left Earth in the Arclight program, and the one cockpit of the Arclight that we're on got stuck in one of the exoplanet's orbits for like 150 years. I think it's Jupiter. I could be wrong.
Neptune, I think.
Neptune. I always mess up my
freaking Neptune.
Whatever. Anyway, they are now arriving, 150 years, 165 years after everyone else did at their new home, Proxima Centauri B. And they're kind of weirded out that when they hail the planet, and find that there's life on it, like human life that has colonized this planet, that they don't get the warm welcome that they're expecting. They're expected to get like a ticker tape parade, and instead they're kind of put on hold and told to stay in orbit, while the people of this planet that now calls itself Yeni Dunya try to figure out like what to do with all of these American interlopers that have arrived above them. And something that the characters learn very quickly, and we, the audience, figure out pretty soon, is that not every ship made it to Yeni Dunya. In fact, only I think 6 other ships made it. And they're from places that don't have the best feelings about Americans and white people in general. And so the Americans find themselves sort of negotiating the status of being refugees in this situation, which is cool and fun and weird.
Yeah, so I think I really enjoyed reading both of these plays, and one of the things I want to think a little bit about in this episode is how do you bring to life a space setting or a spaceship or any of those things on stage, because it's not something that we see very much in institutional theater in the US, where we tend to see street scenes and living room scenes and kitchen scenes and porch scenes and church scenes and that kind of thing, but usually not the more fantastical settings. So what are some of the ways that writers are thinking about bringing these spaces into reality?
Yeah, I think with Last Ship, we're in the cockpit of the Arclight the whole time, even though some things happen to the Arclight between Acts 1 and 2 in Last Ship to Proxima Centauri. And so we get an instant sense of we are not in a cafe, we're not in a living room, we're not in a dining room. We're in this like very utilitarian vehicle that is much larger than what we're used to. Which I find very exciting.
Yeah, The Absentee has a little bit more fluidity in it because a lot of the characters appear on stage but are actually speaking from other places, or are in some cases, like the AI you mentioned, Todd, not actually, physical people at all. But the core, very similarly, the core setting is the cockpit of this, or I guess cockpit's probably not technically the right word, but the like command center.
Like a station.
Yeah, the control room of this remote outpost space station. And we stay there pretty much for the whole play.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that like that is kind of your only option for a play set in space, unless you want to do like a moonwalk sort of situation, only because I feel like space looks in reality probably not very interesting.
Like the actually
like
being
actual,
in space.
like actual space.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the nice things about it is that it does, in some ways, it's very practical, because from just the little bit I've read and seen about, for example, people living on the ISS, you know, your world is very small. There's like, you can't go a lot of places when you're in space. But it also, on a design level, one of the nice things about that is it turns it into a like unit set, more or less. You know, there are good reasons for everything in the play to happen on that command deck, because there's only two people and most of the things they interact with in their day are there.
Are right
so,
there.
like,
Yeah.
why would we see anything else? Yeah, and kind of similarly in the Absentee, the operator spends all her time on the control room there. So that's where pretty much all the action takes place.
It's interesting that in plays that are like often sort of speculative or working in this sort of like not attempting to do realism genre, that there is this limitation of also like there are very few places where humans can survive in space, and there is like a consideration in all of these plays about like, what does that mean? And like, what do you have to do in order to do that? And like all of that sort of thing. So I think it's also interesting that like the location of a ship cockpit and rendering it on stage also invites questions about like gravity and oxygen, and like what are the tangible like ways that these people survive day to day. Like there's a lot of jokes in Proxima Centauri about like when you come out of the like 1,000-year, not 1,000-year, it's shorter than that, but the
it's 2,000 years. It's very long.
I get it confused with a novel that I read recently called Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky, where it's like 10,000 years that you're in stasis, which is a very good book if you haven't read it. But anyway, there's like jokes about them giving you like Starbucks because the ship is from Seattle when you wake up and things like that. So I think that's also an interesting thing, is this sort of like, we're in this very sort of, no pun intended, alien world to us in the lives that we live in real life, but also there is very much a lot of consideration to like, how do you survive in this place, and like what is the human sustainability, like these very mundane considerations, which I think is interesting.
Well, and a funny thing about the Starbucks moment is when they're revived, they have the option to get Starbucks if they want, but immediately after that is offered, we hear, due to the limitations of space travel, like it will be served at room temperature and with like corn sweetener, because there is nothing to help with that, because like we couldn't keep a refrigerator on this ship, because why would we? Which I think is very funny. I was also thinking, Nick and Percy, you were talking about needing to be in like cockpits and control stations. And I immediately thought of, there's a play by James Kennedy that was in the 2016 Humana Festival. That was this little short called Trudy, Carolyn, Martha, and Regina Travel to Outer Space and Have a Pretty Terrible Time There. Which is delightful, but also is set in the cockpit of a spaceship, and then someone gets like spaced from it, if I remember properly. It's very funny. But I hadn't considered the need to show so quickly and so succinctly, like, we are in space. You probably have an idea of what this could look like, which is just very interesting that like you're not doing Star Wars on stage unless you're doing Shakespeare's Star Wars, I guess. But that's got a very different vibe to it. But one of the things that I learned during our production of Last Ship to Proxima Centauri, spoiler alert, we did it at Portland Stage not too long ago, is that every designer was like really pumped about designing a show in space. And this is from like our scenic designer, who at the design meeting was talking about like Rogue One versus Battlestar Galactica versus like all of these other things, which was very exciting to hear. And we went in this like utilitarian sort of Alien-esque in terms of the construction of the set. like military grade cockpits, because that's what they were like. It's a freighter. Like it is something that needs to like, it was built quickly. It needs to work. It's not the Star Trek Enterprise.
Yeah.
Like it's not going to look like that because it's not this like post scarcity beautiful thing that people are intentionally living on. It is something that people happen to be living on, and only two at a time. And so they also wanted it to feel really cramped and really like tight and densely located. But also when we get to Yeni Dunya and we meet some of the people of this new planet, our costume designer was also really excited about like, okay, what does fashion look like 200 years from now if we pull from like these 5 sources or these 6 sources as like points of reference. And so how do we make something that feels both like very alien in terms of our culture and our dress, but also has some familiarity to it? And like, I'll send some pictures to Percy to put in the show notes, but there were these like gold shoes that everyone fell in love with that were just like really cool, really weird kicks that the Proximans wear.
Yeah, well, and I think that's one of the beautiful things about like sci-fi and speculative fiction is that it opens up room for artists to not be purely mimetic. You know what I mean? Like, this is because we're imagining so wildly. It only has to be barely referencing real life, not, you know, so nobody can look at it and be like, that's wrong. That's not what that person would actually be wearing. So, yeah, yes, I think artists often love that kind of challenge or that kind of opportunity. And I wish that more theaters would take a swing at that. I know we've said that before on this podcast. This is not
a recurring theme.
I mean,
yeah,
in
it's
fact,
a recurring theme.
I think it was the last play discussion episode of season 1.
Where we were like,
put ghosts in your goddamn plays, you cowards.
Oh,
well,
yeah.
It's like, yeah. Well, it's because I also think that there's like I think aesthetically theaters who tend to do this sort of thing, like something that we talked to or thought about while preparing for this episode is that high school production of Alien that they did, the play. They just adapted Alien for the stage and got in a lot of trouble for it, but also I think it was very cool, so like whatever. And they write a lot in like the various like interviews and reviews and whatever that were written about it, like very much like making stuff out of trash and using like all of this stuff that they had around and repurposing things and all this stuff. Like I think there's very much like a scrappy aesthetic that tends to come into play for theaters who do this kind of work. Partially, I think probably because they tend to be theaters that don't have a lot of money. But also
this was the North Bergen High School Drama Club,
which is so cool.
Yes.
But yeah, like they talked about using like old milk crates, I think, to make the like interior of the Nostromo and stuff like that. Like very, very cool.
Well, and I recall when that production happened and when all of the like hoopla was happening on Twitter, I remember Mac Rogers, who was recently on the podcast, friend of the pod, talking about how like his whole career, people had pushed against doing like spectacle sci-fi on stage, and he had kind of become convinced that you couldn't do it. And so that's part of like how the Honeycomb trilogy was built, as like a living room drama about an alien invasion and what that means. But he was like, if high schoolers can make this happen, like, why can't we? Why can't we make something that's like beautiful and terrifying and not necessarily like something that doesn't have to look schlocky, something that can look very exciting and intentional and like still be like, oh my God, there's aliens on stage in this sci-fi show.
Yeah, I think there's absolutely, in addition to a fear about putting ghosts on stage, there's also a fear about, like doing zero gravity or like figuring out what a spacewalk would look like theatrically. But like, I don't know, I feel like there's so many viewpoint it. I use harnesses, whatever. Like there's so many cool ways that you could do that. We suspend our disbelief every time we go to the theater.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's actually, to me, it's not even about it not looking schlocky, or maybe I have a different like reference point in my mind for what schlock is, but it's like you could actually do it by being creative. Like the trick, I think, is to not compete with film.
Yeah.
Like looking at the pictures from the North Bergen High School Drama Club production of Alien, it is like very low budget. And I can see Xavier Perez in the Xenomorph outfit, and it's like clearly put together with what they had. But I think the charm of theater is actually in the reenactment, the ritual, the coming together around it. So a spacewalk doesn't have to involve like elaborate flying mechanisms. You can if you want, but it can be much more simple and much more beautiful because, like Percy said, we suspend our disbelief every time anyway. So why not lean into that?
Well, I'm looking at a picture right now of their rendition of the chestburster scene, which has very big like Audrey 2 energy. Like if we can embrace like puppetry and all these, like there's a hand underneath the chestburster, like very clearly like pushing it up into the person's face. Like,
Well, and I'm also thinking of Nick. I think you also saw Six Rounds of Vengeance when Vampire Cowboys did it back in the day, forever ago. But like something that was really exciting about the staging of that was there's this like fun, because it's Qui Gwen. There's like a fun kung fu fight in the middle of it, and in order to do some of the kung fu moves that they wanted to do, they had like set up this convention that sometimes actors are in scenes and sometimes they wear these like black one-piece jumpers, and when they do that they're like special effects. And so to do this cool, like I'm flying across the stage kicking this giant monster thing, someone hopped literally into another person's arms and that person just carried them across the stage and like did the kick. And it was fun because we had built this theatrical vocabulary for like, I ignore people when they're just in these black outfits and I embrace characters when they're in their character get up. And like you could do that for 0G. Like you want to float in the Absentee, like cool, some people pick that person up, great, done.
And it's really not hard to do, and there are whole theater cultures around the world that operate like this. That when I saw Six Rounds of Vengeance, it reminded me of like Bunraku style puppetry, which does a very similar thing with black clad assistant. The second and third puppeteers are all covered in black so that they quote unquote become invisible. And of course you can see them the whole time, but it's a convention that people understand. It's just the Western theater obsession with realism and like attempting to present the real on stage. Ever since the early 20th century, we've been stabbing ourselves in the foot repeatedly.
Yeah, well, and I think it's probably true that the hesitation to do a lot of plays in this sort of genre is partially, I think, because it requires you to think outside the real in a lot of ways. So it is sort of just like, oh, like, let's just not. But shifting gears, I think the thing that is interesting about a lot of plays that are set in space is that a lot of them have either like ship navigation software or some kind of like communicating with somebody who is not physically there as a core part of its conceit, or you're dealing with AIs like in the Absentee. And I think a lot of plays that have AIs or have these sort of like robotic or, non-human elements are exploring something really cool because like 9 times out of 10, you have to have a person play them, which I think is interesting.
Yeah. Last Ship has like Lana, which is a new Siri sort of thing. She does, I think it's logistics and navigations something assistant. But she doesn't have like an intelligence the way the Beacon does in the Absentee. And I think there's so many things about Beacon that are like super, super cool to me. I'm sure this is some of where it comes from, knowing Julia, but we haven't talked about this specifically. But like, to me, the Beacon is very much the robot who is the ship in Outlaw Star, which is like a very weeby point of view to come at this from. But like, there's a lot about this, like, I don't know. There's a lot of cool stuff about her, but also like the way that I imagine Beacon working within the command center is in similar ways to the way that this girl operates an outlaw star, who like is her own person and is also the ship, and who we need to have the ship run. And if you piss off, won't run the ship properly because she has feelings and she has thoughts.
Yeah. And like a central thing that play is exploring is very much like, what is the relationship that somebody who's isolated builds with their AI? And there's absolutely like Beacon has very like utilitarian functions on the ship in terms of like, you know, this is how much energy there is, or what, that's a, you know what I mean? But is also like pretends to be Bob Ross and streams an episode of The Joy of Painting for Operator as she's falling asleep. Like there's all these spectrums. And then, as Todd mentioned before, absolutely the like sort of looming question about Beacon's proximity to Chance, who is the Operator's ex-girlfriend, or dead girlfriend, not ex-girlfriend. I guess also ex.
Little column A, little column
technically
B.
also an X.
Yeah, I think that also shifts us into like thinking about some of the, because I think a lot of plays that are set in space tend to explore sort of similar themes or ask similar questions, although they all certainly answer them very different ways. And like the question of like our relationship with AI and what happens to us when we're in this very deep sort of isolation is one of the big questions, because very frequently the protagonist of a play that is set in space has like a reason that they left Earth, or, you know, something that has driven them to this very, very isolated thing. Like the Operator is sort of escaping this very tragic and traumatic thing that happened to her. Whereas Proxima Centauri, the Earth is not habitable.
Yeah, well, and I wonder if there's almost a, now I'm just riffing, so feel free to say no, but I wonder if there's almost a connection there. I have a friend who's very interested in like theater and the non-human, and there's almost the idea that that sense of isolation, you know, it strikes me that historically we're at an interesting moment where we're renegotiating our relationships with the non-human, both kind of in the future sense of the rise of AIs and increasing like technologization. That's not a word. The pervasiveness of technology in our lives on one hand, and on the other hand, climate change and our relationship with all the non-human like natural systems of our world. And space is sort of in some ways, particularly in the Absentee, I feel like space becomes a sort of in-between place between the Earth that's been left behind and the sort of like technological future that you live within, but is still not fully accessible. For the audience at home, I'm making a weird groping gesture to illustrate the way that AIs are like not,
physical presence.
Yeah, not physical presences and not like operating in the same way that human beings do.
I think just like jumping back to like the things that space plays can explore a little, something that I was reminded of when we started talking about these is just how space is always trying to kill you. Like there's, I remember reading an article when like the Blue Jupiter or Blue Horizon, I don't know, when all the billionaires were trying to get their dicks into space, that this scientist was like, look, Jeff Bezos is not going to live in space like as much as he would like to. The thing about space is always trying to kill you, and the practicalities of surviving in space indefinitely to just live there are not viable with the technology that we have now. It's just like, it's not going to happen in his lifetime. It's not going to happen in your lifetime. Don't worry. They will die on this planet the same way that you will. Which there was sort of a piece to that for me, but I was thinking particularly with like when the beacon becomes unlivable at a certain point within the Absentee. And while it doesn't feel like this is the tension necessarily in Last Ship to Proxima Centauri, the arc light does get damaged and we are made aware that it will not be viable for much longer. And so at the end of the first act, they make the decision to like park it on the planet. And I think there's something interesting about that tension of like literally everything in your environment wants you dead.
Yeah.
Like what the universe would like the most is to like normalize the heat in this area and normalize the vacuum. And the way it does that is like you die. And I think that that's an interesting tension that the Absentee plays with and that comes up in Last Ship, but isn't like a focused theme.
Because I think there are like two ways that plays about space tend to think about space, and the Absentee and Proxima Centauri do both of them. Whereas I think space can be, as Nick said, like an in-between space or like a place to get away from Earth and to go very, very far away and be isolated, or it represents sort of the way to get to something new, which is what it is in Proxima Centauri, which opens up a lot of questions about like a lot of plays about space tend to be about colonization, or tend to be about like, how do we think about this sort of new frontier, quote unquote, in a way that is like, how do we think about that and also think about settler colonialism, and what are the ways that those overlap with each other, and how do we think about those two things at the same time, which is, I think, in part a lot of what Proxima Centauri is thinking about, is like, what does it mean to establish something new and all of that. Like there's a play in space by Phaedra Michelle Scott called Unity that was written for a thesis project at UMass last year, that is about a video game called Unity, based on, so like the people of Earth had basically sent this person called the Companion out to like explore a new planet and see if it was habitable, and that person had all of these logs, and then something went terribly wrong, and they sort of built this like space exploration program with an alliance between the Earth and Mars, and residents of those two planets to like find new places to live, and it's very much thinking about like, do we go in and violently colonize these new planets? Do we sort of establish dominance and like say, okay, like we have to stake our claim because space is so hostile and we have no other choice and we have to keep living? Or is there a way to do it that is gentler and that is like more diplomatic and like really, and I think a lot of plays about space explore that question of like, how do we approach the like finding a new world? Because a lot of plays in space tend to be like, the Earth is no longer an option, or like, I don't want to be there anymore.
Well, and like tying back to Lancer briefly, like one of the ideas that's posed by the lore within the world is that the second committee, which we're like in the era that players are playing, we're in the third committee, but in the second committee, they had this very like, one, fascist, but two, like eco-fascist, human expansion and survival at all costs sort of mindset, and like destroyed the biomes on a number of planets so that they could be habitable for, you know, carbon-based humans. And that's like a thing that this game also grapples with, but that players think about and like comes up in Last Ship, and also we spend no time on. And there's a lot of things going on in that play. Like there's so many things going on in that play. But one of the like blips that we like just scoot over is the people of Yeni Dunya have like terraformed the planet that had a poisonous atmosphere and like poisonous flora and fauna for humans, and have destroyed those things such that human life could survive or adapted them. And that's kind of chilling when you think about it in the space of like 100 years.
It's deeply chilling. Like, you know, is there a kinder and gentler colonialism?
Maybe
I'm
not.
going to go with not really, but I'm not an expert on that.
Doesn't that also come up in a play that we talked about in our Apocalypse Plays episode? Doesn't that also come up in Walden by Amy Berryman? That question of like, or I think that's more about Earth, but...
Walden is really concerned. Walden is really thinking more about the ethics of colonialism or like theoretical space colonization as a question of, is there a defeatism to that, of, you know, the attitude of just like, oh, well, Earth is going to be unlivable, so the best solution is clearly to just go out and do the same thing but on a different planet rather than figuring out ways to actually make Earth habitable, which is, I think, a good point, because any technology sufficient to terraform a planet to make it stable for human life presumably could be used to remedy some problems on Earth. I do think it brings up, there's I think it's a Carl Sagan quote that talks about Mars specifically, and it's basically like, listen, if there are organic beings on Mars, even if they're like microbes, then those are Martians and Mars belongs to them. And I am pretty sure that's a Carl Sagan quote. I will try to double check, but that is a thing to consider in all of these narratives about human expansion. I think it is very comparable to, the westward expansion and colonization of what is now the continental U.S. Like, that's the whole idea behind the final frontier of Star Trek.
Yeah, it's very much about like these plays that are these stories that are very much about human survival. It does sort of hit the question of like, what does that survival come at the cost of?
Mm-hmm. Well, and in this mode, like, I feel like speculative fiction and science fiction is so often like, it's never about, wouldn't it be cool if we had laser guns? And it is always about like, how can we look at the problems of today with a different lens and see if there are other, maybe better futures. And I feel like so often, like as we felt with our Put Ghosts in Your Goddamn Plays, You Cowards episode, I feel so many theaters brush off sci-fi plays because they see them as like, cool, you have laser guns, and which there are no laser guns in either of these shows.
Sorry,
spoiler.
Laser guns in your goddamn plays, you cowards.
But instead, they're, as all good plays are, they are plays about like the human experience and asking big questions about like what it means to be, that happen to be set in space. And so, like, for me, the Absentee, we eventually learn or come to realize that the Absentee is operator. And in some literal senses, she is being asked to be an absentee voter because she's registered in Florida. And we all know the Sunshine State is a nightmare for democracy, but which is one of my favorite lines. But she's also someone who has become absentee from her life. She has like fled her life and the tragedy that befell her and her girlfriend, and has like moved to the cold reaches of space, because it was the place that she could like deal with her grief. And Last Ship is very much, and like Greg says this all the time, it is a play that was very much inspired by the border crisis of 2018 in the States. And he wanted to invent a like fabulated situation where Americans could see themselves on like the wrong side of that border crisis. And like, what does it mean if, while fleeing something terrible that you could not avoid, you are detained, you are interrogated, you are treated like a criminal. What would that look like? And what would that be like? And like, it happens to take place on a spaceship, but that doesn't make it any less relevant.
Well, and I think the important thing about that is that not only is it a way of sort of appreciating and like thinking about things that we deal with right now in a somewhat distanced way, or in a way that like we don't realize that we're thinking about it until we're thinking about it. But also it like, because they're so future oriented, it really opens the door to saying like, okay, now that I've thought about this, what does that mean? And how can we pivot? What is the other option? And sometimes the play like presents that option and sometimes it doesn't. But yeah, I think that's a really cool and powerful thing. Like I know a lot of people are turning to like Octavia Butler's books right now to be like, holy shit, she predicted everything. What the fuck do we do? Yeah.
Well, and in addition to like giving us space to think about like how we could approach these problems differently, like how could we make these problems not the problems? and maybe this is me being sappy, but Glenn, who is calling operator and trying to get her to vote for his candidate, there's this point where she finds that like voting as a tool is useless because like all politicians are shit and like blah, blah, blah. And Glenn goes on this like little rant that always makes me tear up a little bit. I'm kind of tearing up now, but he talks about like all of the things that like voting has achieved. And some of them are things from our past. But a number of them are things from Glenn's past, but our future is like things we could achieve. Ooh. And geez, it's something that like is so powerful and moving and motivating for like, there are things we can accomplish, like using the tools that we have. We don't need to wait for, you know, a terraforming device that will help us take carbon out of the air and put it into the earth or some bullshit, or launch it into the sun or whatever. Like there's things that we could do now using the tools that we have now in order to make a better world for ourselves. And I think like that speech is something that we workshopped that play back in like spring 2018 maybe, and is just like, that speech stays with me all the time, and is just like such a powerful and moving thing, and to not just think about like what can we do, but like here are tools and you have them. Like if you want a better world today, here's some stuff you can do.
Yeah, I feel like that interplay of like the fantastical and the mundane is really core to the way that both of these plays work, and how powerful both of these plays are, because there is that sense of familiarity, despite the fact that, you know, you're in the cockpit of a spaceship.
I guess I will say I love speculative fiction that imagines, like you're saying, Todd, imagines what the future could be in ways that are good and bad. Mm-hmm. Like imagines both good and bad futures. I do think there is also sometimes a risk of doing this, and I think it would be maybe irresponsible not to point to the risk as well, which is the bad, or not even necessarily bad. It's not inherently bad, but the risk of like clumsily metaphorizing real world problems. You know what I mean?
Like there's a lot of, not a lot of, I've seen things that definitely like take up queerness or like gender and think about it through like aliens or androids or like non-human things, which like can be really powerful and resonant, but also can like imply kind of bad things about queer people or trans people.
Yeah, and there's a long history, I think, as well around race.
Yeah.
You know, particularly just if you look at Star Trek, the way various alien species are kind of racially coded, particularly earlier in the series, whatever the plural of, you know, like in the original series and the Next Generation and so on. And I do think that is the one kind of, probably not the one, but one significant real risk that comes with trying to talk about something real without talking about it. And I think that's one reason that the Absentee and Last Ship to Proxima Centauri both work pretty well, is because they are actually talking about that thing. You know what I mean? Like the Absentee is about like you said, being an absentee from your own life and like checking out rather than engaging. And Last Ship to Proxima Centauri is actually about like the violence of borders, period, but also touches on specifically like race relations in the US in the 21st century. The way it's plotted, that specifically is discussed. And I think that's to those plays' credit, rather than being like, we're going to introduce a species of aliens that are made up, but we're going to use them as a metaphor for Black people, which is always bad, I think. Maybe not always, but I shouldn't take the authority to say that, but I think always very risky. How about that?
Mm-hmm. I think it definitely can be. I don't know. Part of me is thinking about the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, which very much like is about race and is not about race at the same time. Like is about race in America and is also like about magic science fiction on a planet that might not be the Earth, but might be, in a way that's very intense. Like I don't know. There's just stuff in that series that like
It's so much.
It's a lot. And is great. Everyone, if you have not read The Broken Earth, go read The Broken Earth. She won 3 Hugos in a row for this trilogy. Go read it. It's great. I think it just needs to be like very intentional. But I also think like that book series, like which is specifically kind of doing what you're saying, is also doing this thing where like the metaphor is also real.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, I actually kind of disagree in that I think what Jemisin does in that is create a like speculation that is about like power and creating an underclass and like using that and like physically violently exploiting that underclass. And I think, you know, because she is an American Black woman and because we're reading it in the US, it is inextricable from the history of racism and slavery in the US. But I don't think she's directly metaphorizing it as much as playing with the same power structure.
I mean, I think there's also some stuff in there about like Roga and the way that like, I think there's very specific things in there that are, I don't know, it's whatever. But I think what is successful about it, which is also what you pointed to about The Absentee and about Last Ship, is that like there is a metaphor and the metaphor is also real in the play. Like they talk about real things in the play as well as this metaphor. And I think in that trilogy, there is like a metaphor of like, is this institutionalized racism in the US? And also, is this institutionalized racism in this world? You know?
Yeah.
Like it doesn't just stay as metaphor. And I think the thing that you were talking about was the Star Trek-y like, oops, all of these people are just weird.
Right. Yeah, no, I guess I guess my thing would be like, I don't think it actually is a metaphor. It is just the same situation in a speculative world. And again, like I said, written by somebody who has that lived experience. So it's baked into it, but it's different. To me, when I say it's a metaphor, I'm talking about like oh God, I haven't watched enough Star Trek to like
the
say
very
this.
Obvious, like this is very clearly coded this way, but we're not going to say anything about it.
Yeah, like I think the Bajorans, if I'm remembering this correctly, like watching Star Trek, the like Bajorans, who are these aliens, feel like very clearly a commentary on like the colonization of Israel and like Palestinian relations. But it's like, we're not going to talk about that. We're just going to be weirdly like, these two peoples have religious conflicts and one is an underclass and everybody's suspicious of them and calls them to. And it's like that, like, you know, I think that kind of metaphor is very difficult to pull off as opposed to like exposing the actual thing, maybe in a context that is not what not the context of the thing in our world.
Yeah, I think it's like, I think you can tell the difference between somebody who's trying to make a point versus somebody who is exploring, because I think a lot of these plays, I don't want to like state that they come from a place of anxiety, because like who am I to decide that that's where they're coming from, but like they come from an emotional place, because a lot of these plays deal with things that are really hard to think about. Like climate disaster is a very difficult thing to think about, and a lot of these plays are thinking about what do we do if this comes to pass. So I feel like you can tell when somebody is really genuinely like, oh, this is coming from like a lived experience that I have, or a fear that I have, or anger that I have, and I'm exploring that through the speculative fiction, whether it be like a cyberpunky, like the world is horrible and the government surveils us even more than they already do. Or like a solar punky, like, you know, we've healed our relationship with nature and everything is art nouveau and beautiful. You know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Dungeons and Drama Nerds. For the next 2 weeks, we'll be finishing up our Lancer campaign, and then we'll have a preview of what's to come in season 3.
Hooray.
Woo!
Dungeons and Drama Nerds is produced by Todd Brian Backus, Percival Hornak, and Nicholas Orvis, and is mixed and edited by Anthony Sertel Dean. If you'd like to help us continue exploring the intersection of theater and tabletop role-playing games, consider leaving us a review on your podcast app of choice or supporting us, and getting access to our patron-only bonus content, at patreon.com/Dungeons and Drama Nerds. You can find our social media and website links, including our cast bios, at the link tree in our show notes. Be sure to tune in next week for another episode of Dungeons and Drama Nerds.
Hello, 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 hello.
No, okay, we won't do that.